I've long held the opinion that the silliest apologetic argument was the claim that legends take centuries to develop and therefore the Gospels must be true because there weren't enough time for them to develop as legends. But that's the bill of goods that Dr. Craig's going to try to sell to us today. Hey there, folks. Bertram the Barely Bearable Atheist here, continuing our series on the book On Guard by Dr. William Lane Craig. And before we get started with Dr. Craig, I want to make a quick correction regarding my last video, and I'd like to thank commenter TessieLab994 for calling me out on this. In response to one of Dr. Craig's arguments, I stated that the first century Jews had no need of oral tradition because they already had both written scriptures and written commentaries. And that ain't an accurate picture because, first of all, I misremembered the dates for the Talmud, and secondly, because every religion has oral traditions with or without written scriptures. So it would have been more accurate to say that they had written scriptures and thus did not need to rely exclusively on oral traditions for their doctrinal content. But they did indeed have oral traditions surrounding their scriptures, and the commentaries weren't written down until about the late 4th century or later, so yeah, I got that one wrong. Sorry about that. Despite that slip-up on my part, however, it's still true that whatever traditions first-century Jews might have had in common, they also had a bunch of conflicting traditions and interpretations and such. So this notion that the first-century Judaism was some kind of monolithic tradition that everybody memorized verbatim, definitely still a myth. There's plenty of things that first-century Jews believed that went above and beyond what was in the formal traditions, and that leaves plenty of room for new oral traditions, like the Gospels, to grow and evolve. Anyways, back to Dr. Craig. Last time, he started out by trying to use the principle of innocent until proven guilty as an argument for why we should just assume that everything anybody tells us is true unless and until some skeptic can prove that it's impossible. And that's obviously an open appeal to gullibility, so that was fun. He followed that up with 5 arguments for why we ought to ignore any evidence presented by historians and critical scholars. And none of his arguments really proved that there's anything wrong with fact-checking the claims of the Gospels, because why would you even try to prove that if the Gospels could pass a fact-check? And I reckon that even Dr. Craig weren't too happy with how he did in those 5 arguments, because in the next section he goes back to the first one and the last one to try and back them up a little bit better. And that's where we's picking up again today. Quote, "First, there was insufficient time for legendary influences to erase the core historical facts. No modern scholar thinks of the Gospels as bald-faced lies, the result of a massive conspiracy. The only places you find such conspiracy theories are on atheist websites and in sensationalist books and movies." End quote. And of course, this is out of date. Mythicism, or in other words, the view that Jesus was an entirely fictional character, is still a minority view among modern scholars, but it's definitely there. Dr. Craig may not have known of any mythicist scholars in 2010 when his book was published, but they do exist today. But that's kind of a tangent, and I think the only reason Dr. Craig threw that in there was to encourage believers to associate atheism with conspiracy theories. Let's let him get on with his argument. Quote, "Rather, ever since the 19th century, skeptical scholars have explained away the Gospels as legends, like stories of Robin Hood or King Arthur. As the stories about Jesus were passed on over the decades, they got muddled and exaggerated and mythologized until the original facts were all but lost." End quote. So notice how he's setting up the reader's expectations for what a legend is. First of all, it's a story about a mundane hero. Brave and noble and successful, certainly, but mundane. No spells, no magic wands, no miracles, just good old-fashioned guts and glory. Also, it's a story that was originally facts, but then it got muddled, exaggerated, and mythologized such that the original facts was lost. There's no allowance here for the possibility that the original stories themselves might have been exaggerations or misunderstandings or deceptions. And that's important because he wants to frame this discussion in terms of historical facts that has to get lost in order for a fictional legend to develop hundreds of years later. And of course, that ain't going to fit the pattern of how the Gospels developed. This is a strategy that comes up fairly often in apologetics. You want to prove that something can't happen, so you focus the audience's attention on one approach that you know ain't gonna work, and then you show that it don't work, and you conclude that, therefore, there's no such thing as any approach that will work. It's like if you wanted to prove that there ain't no way to drive from Nashville to the West Coast. So you get everybody on board a bus and you all drive on over to the East Coast, and then you say, see, this is the East Coast, not the West Coast, which proves that there ain't no way to get from Nashville to the West Coast. And you can see that in how he tries to develop this argument using an argument from Professor Sherwin White, who wrote a book about how legends developed in ancient Greek and Roman society. Quote, the fabulous legends about Alexander the Great did not develop until centuries after Arrian and Plutarch wrote Alexander's biography. According to Sherwin White, the writings of Herodotus enable us to determine the rate at which legend accumulates, and the tests show that even 2 generations is too short a time span to allow legendary tendencies to wipe out the hard core of historical facts. End quote. And obviously, the Gospels didn't originate through a process of legendary tendencies slowly wiping out historical facts over the course of several centuries. So therefore, supposedly, the Gospels can't be a legend in the technical sense that Professor Sherwin White uses the term. And that's fine and everything, but all it really means is that the Gospels is a different kind of legend. See, unlike Alexander and Arthur and Robin Hood, Jesus was a self-styled prophet and faith healer who earned his original fame not by objective military victories and political power, but by getting folks to believe that he was doing supernatural stuff through the power of God. And how the story develops from that kind of a starting point is a whole different process from how legends develop out of secular heroes getting fictional accounts added to their stories centuries later. On the other hand, one thing that Jesus does have in common with Alexander and Arthur and Robin Hood is that none of these legendary embellishments is erasing any historical facts. They's adding to the story, not subtracting from it. So Dr. Craig's insistence on saying that legends erase historical facts is kind of peculiar here. Is this some kind of subtle psychological maneuver to try and make folks think that the Gospels is historical facts that scholars is trying to erase? Or is he trying to make it sound like the New Testament is some kind of book of lost secrets? I can't really tell, but it is peculiar. And by the way, while he's on the topic, apologists get some of their core material from exactly the kinds of legends that Professor Sherwin White describes, like the notion that the apostles all preached the Gospels and died a martyr's death in most cases. We can find contemporary support for Peter, James, John, and Paul preaching the gospel in the first century, but all the stories about all the other apostles and evangelists preaching and being martyred is legends from centuries after the fact. It ain't that the legends erased the historical facts, it's more like there weren't no historical facts there to begin with, and the legends was invented to fill in the gaps. And it took more than just a couple centuries for that all to happen. Meanwhile, Dr. Craig quotes Professor Sherwin White as openly rejecting the notion that the Gospels could be what he classifies as being a legend. Quote, when Professor Sherwin White turns to the Gospels, he finds the skepticism of the radical critics to be quite unjustified. All historians agree that the Gospels were written down and circulated during the first generation after the events, while the eyewitnesses were still alive. End quote. That's misleading in a couple of ways. First of all, notice he says the first generation, not the first century. How long's a generation? 20 years? 40? 60? 100? If somebody had just turned 20 the year Jesus died, and then they lived to be 90, that's going to take us into the 2nd century. Is that still the first generation? Dr. Craig's being sort of vague about when the Gospels was actually written, and he's doing it in a way that makes them sound earlier than they was, and that's misleading. But also remember that in that culture and at that time, all that it took to qualify as a quote-unquote eyewitness was to have a dream or a vision about Jesus being alive after the crucifixion. That's the kind of eyewitness that Paul declares himself to be. And when he talks about Jesus appearing to folks in 1 Corinthians 15, he uses the same word for Jesus appearing to Peter and the rest as he does for himself. So it sounds like that's the kind of eyewitness that the other ones was too. And the big thing that Dr. Craig is leaving out here is that we's talking about an apocalyptic preacher going around telling folks that God was just about to overthrow the entire world order, including the Roman Empire, and was going to establish the kingdom of heaven here on earth. And these so-called eyewitnesses genuinely believed him when he said that. But then, not only was Jesus executed by the Romans, but just a few days later, the very temple of God itself was destroyed by the Roman Empire, which was the exact opposite of what believers was absolutely certain was supposed to happen. So we ain't talking about impartial, objective observers here. We're talking about believers who has wholeheartedly bought into an apocalyptic expectation that failed. And it's going to take a whole double heaping helping a spin to try and make that one sound like Jesus was somehow right all along. It don't take centuries for a disappointed believer to think up some new narrative to prove that they ain't just made laughingstocks of themselves by being so gullible. I mean, if it took them a whole month, that'd be a long time. But sooner or later, that's what they's going to do, because that's what believers always does. Unless they deconstruct their faith and realizes they was wrong to begin with. But there's going to be plenty of folks that refuse to deconstruct, and instead, they double down. And that's a mechanism for producing a kind of legend that Professor Sherwin-White never even looked at. Meanwhile, Dr. Craig drives on, apparently oblivious to the problem. Quote, in fact, adding a time gap of 2 generations to Jesus' death in AD 30 lands you in the 2nd century when the apocryphal Gospels first began to appear. End quote. So based on this, it looks like Dr. Craig is using the standard 40-year figure for how long a generation's supposed to last. And that means that when he says all historians agree that the Gospels was all written down during the 1st generation after Jesus, he's claiming that everyone agrees that they was written sometime between 30 CE and 70 CE. And that's false. The Gospel of John was written between 90 and 100 CE, according to most scholars. And that'd be the 2nd generation by Dr. Craig's reckoning. And he says that the apocryphal Gospels began showing up during the 2nd generation. But you know what else shows up then? According to modern scholars, the epistles of 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus also date to around this same time, decades after Paul's death. The book of 2 Peter also seems to date to around this time frame, as does the book of Jude, which quotes from the apocryphal book of Enoch as if it was scripture. So yeah, if Dr. Craig is trying to give us the impression that there was a clean-cut distinction between the canonical documents and the apocryphal documents, then he is, at best, obfuscating the facts, because history tells us a different story. But, of course, Dr. Craig being Dr. Craig, he has to make it sound like the case for skepticism is falling apart and on the verge of total collapse. Quote, this point becomes even more devastating for skepticism when we realize that the Gospels themselves use sources that go back even closer to the events of Jesus' life. For example, the story of Jesus' suffering and death, commonly called the Passion story, was probably not originally written by Mark. Rather, Mark used a source for this narrative. End quote. Sometimes folks ask me why I insist on calling Dr. Craig Dr. Craig, and why I repeatedly point out that he's a pretty smart feller. And this right here is a pretty good example of why I do that. He's telling us that we don't know where the author of the Gospel of Mark got his material from. In other words, the author of Mark ain't an eyewitness like so many folks likes to claim. We ain't got no idea where he got his stories from. And yet, somehow Dr. Craig manages to frame this admission as if it was a problem for skepticism. He's making out like the weakness of the traditional narrative is somehow devastating to critical historical scholarship. You gotta admit, that's a pretty impressive bit of mental gymnastics there. I ain't accusing Dr. Craig of excessive honesty or intellectual integrity here, but you gotta admit, that is pretty smart. Now, the unspoken assumption that Dr. Craig is sneaking in here is that if Mark used a source, it must have been a written source, even though earlier he tried to argue that early Christians would have used some complicated system of memorization to pass on some kind of standardized oral tradition verbatim. The problem is that whether oral or written, this notion that the story was somehow fixed and unchangeable is based on nothing more than wishful thinking. We ain't got any documentary evidence for any such thing. It's just a modern oral tradition, a story that believers embraces as true simply because it validates beliefs that they has a hard time validating otherwise. And the fact is, this mythical certainty and unanimity within the early Christian church ain't consistent with what we know historically about the diversity of traditions and doctrines in the early church. Not to mention what social media has shown us about how viral stories spreads. The author of Mark was definitely relying on sources outside of his own personal experiences, and them sources ain't identifiable or verifiable, so we needs to treat them accordingly. Dr. Craig makes his final point by appealing to the letters of Paul. Quote, "Or again, Paul in his letters passes on information concerning Jesus about his teachings, the Last Supper, his betrayal, crucifixion, burial, and resurrection appearances. What he passes on in his first letter to the Corinthian church about Jesus' resurrection appearances has been dated to within 5 years after Jesus' death." End quote. And it's true that Paul's account of the death, burial, and supposed resurrection of Jesus is decades earlier than the accounts that was written in the later Gospels. But even if it is that early, that's a problem, because the story that Paul tells is significantly different than the stories that appear in the later Gospels. Let's look at how Paul describes the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus at the start of 1 Corinthians 15. Quote, "For I handed down to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. After that he appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters at one time, most of whom remain until now, but some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared to me also." End quote. So notice the active word here is appeared. He appeared to Cephas and the 12, which, by the way, is kind of interesting on account of Judas weren't replaced until after the ascension, according to Acts. And then he appeared to 500 brothers and sisters, and then to James, and then to all the apostles, and lastly to Paul himself. But notice if you read the gospel accounts of Jesus' ministry before the crucifixion, that ain't how they describe it. The Gospels don't say Jesus appeared to the Pharisees or Jesus appeared to the money changers in the temple. They say Jesus spoke to the Pharisees and he made a whip of cords and drove the money changers out of the temple. Or consider the story of the supposed resurrection of Lazarus. Story don't say that Lazarus appeared to folks after Jesus supposedly resurrected him. It says he walked out of his own tomb. In other words, the language that Paul uses in 1 Corinthians 15 ain't the language that's normally used for somebody who's literally physically present. Paul is using the language that's commonly used to describe dreams and visions. Now, decades later, a bunch of anonymous authors wrote a bunch of gospels that added all kinds of embellishments to emphasize the idea that Jesus was supposedly, literally, physically resurrected. But see, Paul ain't doing that. They don't even specify that Jesus was necessarily resurrected down here on the earth. For all that Paul tells us, Jesus could have been raised in a spiritual body in heaven and then appeared in visions to everybody just like he supposedly did to Paul. Because Paul uses the same Greek word for every appearance, whether it was to him or to somebody else. And in fact, I kind of think that's exactly what Paul did believe and preach back in the early days of Christianity, because further on down in chapter 15, he brings up the debate over whether or not the resurrection was actually real. And the thing is, if Christians had been preaching a literal physical resurrection since day one, that wouldn't ever be a debate among Christians. If you didn't believe in actual resurrections, you wouldn't convert to a religion based on an actual resurrection in the first place. This would be a debate between Christians and non-Christians, not a debate between believers. And of course, Paul points out that you can't be a Christian without believing in the resurrection of Jesus, but then his argument takes a turn that seems kind of peculiar in the context of modern Christian doctrine. He argues that Jesus was resurrected in a spiritual body, which he claims is better than if God had raised the body that was buried. Which does kind of open up the question of whether or not a spiritual resurrection is a real resurrection. Paul argues that a spiritual resurrection is, if anything, even more real than a physical one would have been. Starting in verse 35, he writes, quote, "But someone will say, 'How are the dead raised? And with what kind of body do they come?' You fool, that which you sow does not come to life unless it dies. And that which you sow you do not sow the body which is to be, but a bare grain, perhaps of wheat or something else." End quote. And skipping on down to verse 42, he writes, quote, "So also is the resurrection of the dead. It is sown a perishable body, it is raised an imperishable body. It is sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness, it is raised in power. It is sown a natural body, it is raised a spiritual body. If there is a natural body, there is also a spiritual body." End quote. Over and over again, he emphasizes the difference between the natural body that gets buried and the spiritual body that gets raised. And the spiritual body is supposed to be a better body. It ain't perishable on account of it ain't physical. So if Jesus had been resurrected physically, that would have been a big step backwards, according to Paul. The body that gets buried is not the body that gets raised. And he emphasizes this again in verse 50, when he says that flesh and blood can't inherit the kingdom of God, and that the perishable can't inherit the imperishable. A physical resurrection ain't good enough, according to Paul. It's got to be a spiritual resurrection. Nowadays, of course, Christians believe in a literal physical resurrection. So Paul ultimately lost that debate. The materialists in the early church won out and made it official doctrine that Jesus was physically raised from the dead, and that's what makes it an actual resurrection. And that's why the later Gospels adds the embellishments to make Jesus look like he was physically there and weren't just a dream or a vision. But that ain't what Paul believed, and he did the best he could to argue against it, which leaves modern Christians with a kind of have your cake and eat it too theology in which Jesus was physically raised in a spiritual body. Because even though Paul contradicts what they believe, they can't accuse Paul of being wrong. And the thing is, to go back to Dr. Craig's original point, it don't take centuries for these kinds of stories to get started. One or a few folks has dreams and visions, and then somebody like Paul comes along and rationalizes the visions as a spiritual resurrection. Then other folks comes along in Paul's own lifetime to reimagine his spiritual resurrection into being a literal physical resurrection, complete with embellished details to validate the story. We see this same sort of thing happening all the time in social media and disinformation campaigns. Folks twists the facts in real time to suit their own agendas without needing to spend centuries waiting for so-called legendary influences to erase any historical facts. That's what's going on today, and that's what was going on in the first century. And we can see it in the actual text of the canonical New Testament books. The gospel story we have today arose from a dynamic conflict between competing oral traditions and cultural influences, and centuries later, the dominant tradition wrote a canon that you could say erased the historical facts, at least in the minds of believers. And I'm sure there's more that could be said, but that's going to about do it for me for today. Next time, Dr. Craig's going to try and argue that the gospel writers was reliable historians no matter what the evidence says. And that just ain't going to work. Meanwhile, thanks for watching, and please be kind wherever possible.